Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is Bible plagues. Historical proof. Revealed, you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Bible plagues. Historical proof revealed. Have you ever wondered whether the 10 plagues described in the book of Exodus were real historical events, or whether they were simply powerful religious stories passed down through generations? It is one of the oldest debates in history. For thousands of years, believers have accepted the biblical account as a record of God's judgment upon Egypt, while skeptics have argued that the story belongs to mythology rather than history. Yet over the last 2 centuries, archaeologists, geologists, climatologists, and historians have uncovered evidence that has forced many researchers to ask an unexpected question. What if at least part of the biblical story was inspired by real natural disasters that occurred in ancient Egypt? This question is far more complicated than it first appears. Ancient civilizations rarely recorded their defeats. Kings celebrated victories, not humiliations. Empires built monuments to display power, not weakness. If Egypt truly experienced a devastating national catastrophe, would its rulers have carved that failure into stone for future generations to read? Probably not. That simple fact explains why historians must rely on fragments of evidence scattered across ancient texts, archaeological discoveries, environmental records, and the writings of neighboring civilizations. The biblical account begins with a confrontation between 2 extraordinary figures. One is Moses, raised within Egypt's royal household, but later called by God to free the Israelites from slavery. The other is Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth according to the standards of the ancient world. Their conflict is not merely political. It is presented as a contest between divine authority and human pride. According to Exodus, Pharaoh repeatedly refuses to release the Israelites despite Moses' warnings. Each refusal is followed by another plague, each more severe than the last. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs invade every home. Gnats cover the land. Swarms of flies fill the air. Livestock die. Painful boils spread across the population. Massive hailstorms destroy crops. Locusts consume what remains. Darkness covers Egypt. Finally, the death of the firstborn forces Pharaoh to surrender. To modern readers, these events can appear supernatural beyond explanation. Yet researchers have noticed something remarkable. Many of these disasters could occur naturally under very unusual environmental conditions. Even more surprising, they appear in a sequence that makes ecological sense. Imagine a massive environmental disturbance affecting the Nile River. If the river became contaminated, fish would die. Without fish, frogs would leave the water searching for survival. As frogs died, insects would multiply rapidly because one of their major predators had disappeared. Those insects could spread disease among animals and humans. crop failures would increase food shortages. Dust storms or volcanic ash could darken the sky. One disaster could trigger another in a devastating chain reaction. This does not automatically prove the biblical account. Instead, it raises an important possibility. Perhaps the biblical narrative preserved memories of real disasters that later became understood as acts of divine judgment. One of the first challenges historians face is establishing the date of the Exodus itself. Surprisingly, there is no universal agreement. Some scholars argue for the 15th century BC, around 1446 BC. Others believe a 13th century date, around 1270 to 1250 BC, better matches archaeological evidence. Both positions have strengths and weaknesses. The 15th century theory relies heavily on biblical chronology. Certain passages in the Old Testament appear to place the Exodus approximately 480 years before Solomon began building the temple in Jerusalem. Working backward from accepted dates for Solomon's reign leads many biblical scholars to around 1446 BC. The later date focuses on Egyptian archaeology. During the reign of Ramesses II, Egypt built enormous construction projects in the Nile Delta, including the city of Pi-Ramesses, a location mentioned in Exodus. Some historians believe this connection places the Exodus during the reign of Ramesses II or his successor. Neither theory has convinced everyone. Instead, historians continue comparing new discoveries with ancient texts in search of stronger evidence. Another important source enters the discussion, the Ipuwer Papyrus. This remarkable Egyptian document has fascinated researchers for generations. Written as a poem of national disaster, it describes a land overwhelmed by chaos. Rivers appear filled with blood, servants flee, society collapses, death spreads across the country. Food becomes scarce, order disappears. At first glance, these descriptions sound astonishingly similar to Exodus. Some writers have claimed the Ipuwer Papyrus proves the biblical plagues happened exactly as described. Others strongly disagree. Egyptologists point out that the surviving manuscript was copied centuries after the events it may describe, and the language belongs to a literary style known as pessimistic literature rather than straightforward historical reporting. Still, the similarities remain intriguing. Could both texts preserve memories of a much older catastrophe? Or are the similarities simply coincidence? No one knows for certain. Modern archaeology teaches an important lesson. Evidence rarely provides absolute certainty. Instead, researchers build probabilities by comparing hundreds of small clues. That process has transformed our understanding of many ancient events, once considered legendary. For centuries, the city of Troy was dismissed as fiction because Homer's Iliad described gods interfering in human affairs. Then archaeologists discovered that Troy had actually existed. Likewise, many details once doubted in the Bible have later received archaeological support. Ancient cities, forgotten kings, inscriptions, and administrative records have repeatedly confirmed that biblical writers often described genuine historical places and people. This does not prove every miracle occurred exactly as written, but it demonstrates that the biblical world was a real historical setting rather than an imaginary landscape. Egypt itself was one of history's greatest civilizations. Its wealth depended almost entirely upon the Nile River. Every year the river flooded, leaving fertile soil across the floodplain. Crops flourished, trade expanded. Massive temples rose above the desert. Pharaoh ruled as both king and divine representative. This dependence on the Nile makes the first plague especially significant. If the river truly became contaminated, the consequences would reach every level of Egyptian society. Water meant life. Without clean water, everything else began to collapse. Some scientists have proposed that unusually high concentrations of red algae could explain the biblical description of water appearing like blood. Similar events have occurred in modern lakes and coastal waters. These blooms consume oxygen, killing fish and producing an intense reddish appearance. Others suggest that heavy volcanic ash, carried through atmospheric systems after a major eruption, could have altered river conditions. One volcanic eruption often appears in these discussions: the eruption of Thera on the island of Santorini. This explosion ranks among the largest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. It devastated much of the eastern Mediterranean. Ash spread across enormous distances. Tsunamis struck nearby coastlines. Climate patterns may have shifted for years afterward. Some researchers believe environmental consequences from Thera could have contributed to unusual conditions throughout the region, including Egypt. Others argue that the eruption occurred too early to match most proposed Exodus dates. The debate continues. As science advances, new dating techniques continue refining our understanding of ancient climate events. Interestingly, researchers studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica can identify volcanic eruptions that occurred thousands of years ago. Tree rings reveal years of drought or unusual weather. Sediment layers preserve environmental changes invisible to the naked eye. These scientific records allow historians to compare biblical descriptions with independently measured environmental events. This combination of archaeology, geology, climatology, and textual analysis has created an entirely new field of interdisciplinary research. Rather than asking only whether miracles happened, scholars also investigate what physical events might have accompanied those miracles. For believers, natural explanations do not necessarily remove divine involvement. If an extraordinary sequence of disasters occurred precisely when Moses confronted Pharaoh, many would still interpret that timing as evidence of divine intervention. Others see only coincidence shaped into religious tradition. Both perspectives continue to fuel one of history's greatest debates. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the Exodus story is not a single plague, but their sequence. One event appears to trigger another. Environmental scientists call this a cascading ecological failure. When one part of an ecosystem collapses, countless others follow. Fish die, frogs flee, insects multiply, disease spreads, livestock perish. Food shortages develop, human society weakens. Whether viewed through faith or science, the progression described in Exodus displays a remarkable internal logic that continues to surprise researchers today. As we continue this journey, We will examine every plague individually. We will compare biblical descriptions with archaeological discoveries. We will investigate Egyptian records. We will explore scientific theories. We will separate confirmed evidence from speculation. And we will discover why, after more than 3,000 years, the mystery of the biblical plagues remains one of history's greatest unsolved questions. The deeper we dig into the ancient world, the more complex the story becomes. Every new discovery answers one question while raising three more. Somewhere between faith, history, and science lies a fascinating puzzle that has captivated scholars for generations. The story of the first plague begins with the Nile, but to understand why this event shocked Egypt so deeply, we first need to understand what the Nile truly meant. For the Egyptians, the Nile was far more than a river. It was the heartbeat of the entire civilization. Every harvest depended on its annual floods. Every city relied on its waters for drinking, farming, transportation, and trade. Without the Nile, Egypt would have been little more than scattered settlements surrounded by endless desert. The Egyptians even believed the Nile was a gift from their gods. The annual flooding was associated with divine blessing, and many religious ceremonies celebrated its life-giving power. If the river failed, people feared that the gods themselves had become angry. This is one reason the first plague was so psychologically devastating. According to the book of Exodus, Moses struck the waters of the Nile with his staff, and the river turned to blood. Fish died, the river smelled terrible, and the Egyptians could no longer drink its water. Every pond, canal, reservoir, and container filled with water was affected. For centuries, readers imagined the river literally becoming human blood. Others believed the description was symbolic. Modern researchers have explored a different possibility. Could the river have appeared blood red because of a natural environmental disaster? One of the most discussed explanations involves harmful algal blooms, sometimes called red tides. Although they are more common in oceans than rivers, certain microorganisms can multiply rapidly under unusual environmental conditions. Some species produce deep red pigments, turning large bodies of water crimson. These blooms consume oxygen, causing massive fish deaths and making the water unsafe for animals and humans. Even today, similar events occasionally occur around the world. Lakes suddenly change color. Rivers become polluted. Millions of fish die within days. The water develops a foul smell, and wildlife begins to disappear. If something similar happened in ancient Egypt, it would have been unlike anything most people had ever witnessed. Another scientific theory focuses on sediment rather than algae. During periods of extreme flooding, enormous quantities of reddish soil from Ethiopia can be carried downstream into the Nile. Combined with certain microorganisms and low oxygen levels, the river can take on a dark red appearance. Fish may suffocate and drinking water becomes contaminated. Researchers have also suggested that volcanic activity elsewhere in the eastern Mediterranean could have altered regional weather patterns, increasing rainfall or changing river conditions enough to trigger ecological collapse. None of these theories perfectly explains every detail recorded in Exodus, but each demonstrates that unusual natural events can produce scenes remarkably similar to the biblical description. The death of the fish is especially significant. Fish were not merely a source of food. They played an important role in the Nile's ecosystem. When fish populations suddenly collapse, insects lose one of their natural predators. At the same time, decaying fish create ideal breeding conditions for bacteria and insects. This leads directly to the next plague. According to Exodus, frogs suddenly emerged from the Nile in overwhelming numbers. They entered homes, kitchens, bedrooms, temples, ovens, and storage areas. They covered the land until life became unbearable. At first glance, this sounds impossible. Yet biologists point out that frogs are extremely sensitive to water quality. They breathe partly through their skin, making them vulnerable to pollution, toxins, or oxygen depletion. If the Nile became contaminated, frogs would instinctively leave the water in search of cleaner habitats. Modern environmental disasters have produced similar behavior. Following chemical spills or severe pollution, amphibians have been observed abandoning rivers and lakes in enormous numbers. Entire frog populations sometimes migrate almost simultaneously when their habitat becomes toxic. But escaping the river would not save them forever. Without clean water and suitable breeding grounds, many frogs would soon die. Their decaying bodies would create yet another ecological problem. Millions of dead amphibians scattered across farmland and villages would attract flies, bacteria, and other insects while producing unbearable odors. Notice something remarkable. The biblical sequence still follows ecological logic. Contaminated water, dead fish, frogs flee, frogs die, insects multiply. Each event naturally increases the likelihood of the next. This cascading pattern has fascinated environmental scientists because it reflects the behavior of real ecosystems. Ancient writers could easily have listed random disasters. Instead, Exodus presents them in a sequence that appears surprisingly interconnected. Some scholars argue that suggests the narrative preserves memories of genuine environmental events. Others believe later authors intentionally arranged the plagues into a logical literary structure to emphasize divine control over nature. Both interpretations remain possible. The frogs themselves carried powerful symbolic meaning within Egyptian religion. One of Egypt's best-known fertility goddesses was Heke, often depicted with the head of a frog. She represented birth, renewal, and life. Imagine the emotional impact if an animal considered sacred suddenly became a national curse. Instead of symbolizing life, frogs became a source of death and disease. Whether viewed as coincidence or deliberate theological symbolism, the message would have been unmistakable to every Egyptian living at the time. Many biblical scholars believe this pattern continues throughout all 10 plagues. Each plague appears to challenge something Egypt considered sacred: its river, its animals, its agriculture, its weather, its gods, and ultimately Pharaoh himself. From this perspective, the plagues were not random punishments. They systematically demonstrated that the God of Israel held authority over every aspect of creation that Egypt believed belonged to its own deities.
While this interpretation comes from theology rather than archaeology, it helps explain why the biblical account presents the plagues in the order that it does.
Of course, historians must be cautious. Ancient texts often combine historical memory with religious interpretation. An earthquake may become described as divine judgment. A drought may become a heavenly warning. A military victory may be attributed to supernatural intervention. This does not necessarily make the events fictional. Instead, it reflects how ancient civilizations understood history. Unlike modern historians, they rarely separated natural events from spiritual meaning. To them, both belonged to the same reality. Another fascinating question concerns Egyptian records. If millions of frogs invaded the land, why do we not possess official Egyptian documents describing the disaster? The answer may lie in the nature of ancient royal inscriptions. Egyptian kings rarely recorded national humiliation. Temple walls celebrated victories, successful harvests, military triumphs, and divine favor. Defeats were often ignored. Political disasters disappeared from official monuments. Historians have discovered many examples of this practice. When Egyptian armies suffered military defeats, later inscriptions sometimes omitted them entirely. Pharaohs preferred to shape history rather than simply record it. Therefore, the absence of Egyptian records cannot automatically be treated as evidence that the plagues never occurred. Instead, historians search for indirect evidence. They examine climate records, archaeological layers, ancient papyri, neighboring civilizations, environmental changes preserved beneath the earth. Each piece contributes to a much larger puzzle. As modern technology improves, researchers continue uncovering new clues. Satellite imagery reveals ancient river channels hidden beneath desert sands. Chemical analysis identifies pollution trapped inside ancient sediments. DNA studies reconstruct diseases that affected populations thousands of years ago. Every scientific breakthrough allows historians to revisit questions once considered impossible to answer. Perhaps that is why the Exodus story continues attracting attention from believers and skeptics alike. It exists at the intersection of faith, history, archaeology, and science. Each discipline approaches the evidence differently. Each discovers something valuable, yet none has solved the mystery completely. The deeper we investigate the first two plagues, the clearer one pattern becomes. They are not isolated miracles. They form the beginning of a chain reaction. A damaged river disrupts wildlife. Wildlife disruption changes insect populations. Insect populations influence disease. Disease threatens agriculture. Agriculture affects society itself. What begins as contaminated water may ultimately transform an entire civilization. And according to Exodus, the worst disasters were still ahead. By the time the frogs had disappeared, Egypt should have been able to recover. The Nile still flowed. The fields still stretched across the floodplain, and the great cities still stood beneath the blazing sun. But according to the book of Exodus, the worst was not over. In many ways, the first two plagues had only prepared the land for something even more destructive. When millions of frogs died, They did not simply vanish. Their bodies were left scattered across fields, villages, canals, and riverbanks. Ancient societies had no modern sanitation systems capable of removing such an enormous amount of decaying organic matter. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. More importantly, the decomposition created perfect breeding conditions for insects. The Bible next describes a plague translated in different versions as gnats, lice, or mosquito-like insects. The original Hebrew word is difficult to translate with complete certainty, and scholars continue to debate exactly which insect was meant. Whatever the creature was, the biblical account describes it as covering both humans and animals, becoming impossible to escape. Modern entomologists find this sequence particularly interesting. When amphibians disappear from an ecosystem, insect populations often increase dramatically. Frogs consume enormous numbers of insects every day. Remove millions of frogs from the environment, and one of nature's most effective forms of pest control disappears almost overnight. This is not speculation alone. Ecologists have documented similar chain reactions in modern ecosystems. When a predator declines, the species it normally controls can multiply at astonishing speed. Sometimes the increase is so rapid that entire ecosystems become unbalanced. Could something similar have happened in ancient Egypt? Many researchers believe it is certainly possible. Warm temperatures, standing water, decaying organic material, and the sudden loss of natural predators create ideal conditions for insect explosions. If the Nile had already been contaminated and frogs had died across the country, swarms of biting insects could easily have followed. Such insects are more than a nuisance. Mosquitoes, biting flies, and other parasites spread disease among both humans and livestock. Even today, they remain responsible for millions of illnesses worldwide. Ancient Egypt, without insecticides or modern medicine, would have been especially vulnerable. Imagine daily life under those conditions. Every step outside brings clouds of biting insects. Children cannot sleep. Farm animals become restless. Food preparation becomes nearly impossible. Workers abandon the fields. Even religious ceremonies are disrupted as priests struggle to remain ceremonially clean. The Bible makes an interesting observation here. According to Exodus, Pharaoh's magicians had previously been able to imitate some of Moses' earlier signs, but when this plague appeared, they admitted defeat. "This is the finger of God," they reportedly told Pharaoh. Whether understood literally or symbolically, this moment marks a turning point in the story. For the first time, even Pharaoh's own advisors acknowledge that something extraordinary is happening. Yet Pharaoh refuses to change his decision. This repeated refusal introduces one of the Bible's most debated themes, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Sometimes the text says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Other times it says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. The relationship between these two statements has generated centuries of theological discussion. Some interpret it to mean Pharaoh repeatedly chose stubbornness until his character became permanently fixed. Others believe God strengthened Pharaoh's existing determination to accomplish a larger purpose. Regardless of interpretation, the narrative presents Pharaoh as remaining unwilling to release the Israelites despite increasing national suffering. The next plague raises the stakes even further. Exodus describes enormous swarms of flies filling Egyptian homes, covering the land and making normal life impossible. Again, historians debate the exact species involved. The Hebrew word may refer to ordinary flies, biting flies, or mixed swarms of insects. Whatever their identity, their arrival follows the ecological pattern established earlier. Dead fish, escaping frogs, decaying animals, exploding insect populations. Each stage naturally increases the likelihood of the next. Some researchers suggest the insects may have included stable flies or horse flies, both known for transmitting dangerous diseases to livestock. Others point to houseflies, which rapidly spread bacteria by moving between waste and food supplies. Either possibility would have created serious public health problems. One detail stands out in the biblical account. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was reportedly spared from this plague. For believers, this demonstrates God's protection over his people. From a historical perspective, some scholars note that localized environmental disasters sometimes affect one region more severely than another due to geography, water sources, or climate differences. Whether miraculous or natural, the contrast becomes central to the biblical narrative. The distinction also increases pressure on Pharaoh. He can no longer dismiss the disasters as ordinary misfortune, affecting everyone equally. The pattern now appears selective. Egypt suffers, Israel is protected. As insect populations exploded, another danger emerged. Many biting insects serve as carriers for diseases affecting cattle, horses, sheep, goats, and other domesticated animals. Livestock formed the backbone of Egypt's economy. Oxen plowed fields. Donkeys transported goods. Sheep and goats provided wool and milk. Cattle symbolized wealth and agricultural strength. A widespread animal disease would threaten every aspect of Egyptian life. Interestingly, modern veterinary science recognizes numerous diseases transmitted by insects. Some spread through bites. Others move from contaminated environments. Still others require only favorable environmental conditions following floods or ecological disruption. Although historians cannot identify a specific disease responsible for the biblical account, they acknowledge that environmental collapse often increases the likelihood of epidemics among animal populations. The biblical sequence once again mirrors ecological reality. The deeper scientists examine these events, the more interconnected they appear. One disaster rarely remains isolated. Nature operates as a network. When one link breaks, countless others feel the effects. This principle is well understood today. Ancient observers lacked modern ecological science. Yet the Exodus narrative describes a remarkably consistent chain reaction. Was this careful literary design? Was it based on eyewitness memory? Or was it both? No definitive answer exists. Archaeologists continue searching for evidence within ancient Egyptian settlements. Some excavations have uncovered signs of sudden abandonment.
Others reveal periods of environmental stress, reduced agricultural production, or changing settlement patterns. However, connecting any single discovery directly to the Exodus remains difficult. Ancient chronology is complicated. Dating methods continue improving, but uncertainties remain. Still, researchers agree on one important point. Egypt experienced multiple environmental crises throughout its long history. Droughts occurred, floods varied dramatically, diseases spread among humans and animals, crop failures happened, political instability sometimes followed natural disasters. The question is not whether Egypt suffered catastrophes. It certainly did. The real question is whether one particular sequence of disasters inspired the biblical account preserved in Exodus. As we continue exploring the evidence, the story becomes increasingly compelling. Every plague appears connected to those before it. Every disaster weakens Egypt further, and every refusal by Pharaoh allows the crisis to deepen. The confrontation is no longer simply between Moses and Pharaoh. It has become a struggle involving the entire Egyptian civilization. The river has failed. Wildlife has collapsed. Insects dominate the land. The nation's economy begins to tremble. Yet according to Exodus, the greatest blows against Egypt's strength were still waiting. By the time Egypt reached the fourth plague, the country was already under enormous pressure. The Nile had become undrinkable. Fish had died in huge numbers. Frogs had flooded the land before dying themselves. Swarms of insects now filled villages, fields, and royal cities. Every day became more difficult than the last. Yet according to the book of Exodus, an even greater disaster was approaching, one that threatened the very foundation of Egypt's economy. In the ancient world, livestock represented far more than food. Cattle pulled plows across fertile fields. Donkeys carried supplies between cities. Horses strengthened military power. Sheep and goats provided wool, milk, and meat. Losing these animals meant losing transportation, agriculture, trade, and wealth all at once. Exodus records that a severe disease spread among the livestock of Egypt. Horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats were struck. The loss was described as devastating. Once again, Pharaoh was warned beforehand. Once again, he refused to release the Israelites. Historians and veterinarians have long asked whether such an epidemic could occur naturally. The answer is yes. Even today, livestock diseases can spread with alarming speed under favorable conditions. Some illnesses move through direct contact between animals. Others are carried by insects. Still others thrive after floods, pollution, or unusual climate changes. One disease often mentioned is anthrax. Anthrax has existed for thousands of years and can infect cattle, sheep, goats, and other grazing animals. Spores can survive in soil for decades before becoming active under the right environmental conditions. When outbreaks occur, they can kill large numbers of animals in a very short time. Another possibility is Rift Valley fever, a viral disease spread by mosquitoes. Large outbreaks usually follow periods of flooding,
because mosquito populations increase rapidly. Livestock suffer first, and humans sometimes become infected as well. Neither disease can be proven as the cause of the biblical plague. Nevertheless, both demonstrate that environmental disruption followed by insect explosions can create the conditions for widespread animal epidemics. Notice how closely this fits the sequence already described. Contaminated water, dead fish, mass frog migration, explosion of insects, livestock disease. Each event naturally prepares the way for the next. Modern ecology calls this a cascade of interconnected failures. Ancient writers simply described what they believed they had witnessed. The biblical account also notes something curious. The livestock belonging to the Israelites in the land of Goshen reportedly remained unharmed. From a theological perspective, this showed divine protection. From a historical perspective, localized disease outbreaks are not impossible. Geography, water sources, grazing conditions, and insect populations can vary even across relatively short distances. Whether miraculous or natural, the distinction again emphasizes the growing separation between Egypt and the Israelites. Pharaoh investigated the situation and reportedly discovered that Israelite livestock had survived. Even then, he refused to change his mind. The narrative now shifts from animals to human suffering. Moses is instructed to take soot from a furnace and throw it into the air before Pharaoh. According to Exodus, fine dust spread across Egypt, and painful boils broke out on people and animals alike. This plague has generated significant medical discussion. Boils are painful skin infections that may result from bacterial diseases, insect bites, allergic reactions, or exposure to contaminated environments. If insect populations had already exploded across Egypt, disease transmission would have become much more likely. Some researchers again point to anthrax. Cutaneous anthrax produces dark sores surrounded by swollen tissue. Although not identical to the biblical description, it demonstrates how animal disease can spread to humans under certain conditions. Others suggest severe bacterial infections resulting from insect bites or contaminated water. Still, others argue that volcanic ash from distant eruptions could have irritated skin and worsened existing infections. No explanation perfectly matches every detail, yet the medical possibilities remain striking. The Bible even states that Pharaoh's magicians could no longer stand before Moses because they themselves were covered with boils. For the first time, the royal court appears physically overwhelmed by the disasters affecting the nation. The psychological impact would have been enormous. Ancient Egypt placed tremendous importance on ritual purity. Priests were required to maintain strict standards of cleanliness before entering temples. Painful skin diseases would have disrupted religious ceremonies across the country. The crisis was no longer limited to rivers or fields. It had reached people's own bodies. This gradual progression is one reason many historians find the Exodus narrative so fascinating. Rather than describing 10 unrelated miracles, the story unfolds almost like a carefully escalating disaster. Each plague is worse than the one before. Each affects a broader part of Egyptian society. Each increased pressure on Pharaoh. Still, the king refuses. Some scholars argue that this repeated refusal reflects more than personal pride. Pharaoh was believed to be a living god. Admitting defeat before Moses would not merely represent political weakness. It would challenge the entire religious and political system upon which Egyptian authority rested. If Pharaoh acknowledged that another god's power exceeded his own, his legitimacy as ruler could be questioned. Seen from this perspective, his stubbornness becomes easier to understand. He was defending not only his throne, but the very ideology of Egyptian kingship. Archaeologists studying ancient Egypt often emphasize that religion and government were inseparable. The pharaoh governed because he was considered divinely appointed. Temples supported the state supported the temples. A crisis affecting religion inevitably became a political crisis as well. This connection explains why each plague appears to challenge an important aspect of Egyptian belief. The Nile, sacred animals, health, agriculture, weather, darkness, life itself. The biblical narrative portrays every source of Egyptian confidence gradually collapsing. Whether one interprets the story as history, theology, or both, its structure is remarkably consistent. Modern readers sometimes expect our archaeological discoveries to provide dramatic proof, a single inscription saying, "The plagues happened exactly this way." History rarely works like that. Instead, evidence comes in fragments. A damaged settlement here, an ancient papyrus there, climate records, disease studies, geological findings. Individually, each clue tells only part of the story. Together, they create possibilities rather than certainty. That is why the Exodus continues to inspire debate among scholars around the world. Believers see confirmation. Skeptics see coincidence. Historians continue searching for stronger evidence. One fact remains undeniable. Ancient Egypt was not immune to natural disasters. Its long history includes epidemics, famines, droughts, political collapse, and environmental change. Whether the biblical plagues describe one extraordinary sequence of real events remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered questions. As the story moves forward, Egypt's suffering is about to expand beyond disease and into the skies themselves. As Egypt struggled to recover from disease, another warning arrived. Moses once again stood before Pharaoh with the same demand that had echoed throughout the confrontation from the very beginning. Let the Israelites go. Once again, Pharaoh refused. This time, according to the book of Exodus, the disaster would come not from the river or the land, but from the sky. The Bible describes an extraordinary storm, unlike anything Egypt had experienced before. Thunder roared across the heavens, lightning flashed continuously. Huge hailstones crashed into the earth. Crops were destroyed, trees were shattered, animals and people caught outside were struck down. Fields that had survived the earlier plagues were devastated in only a few hours. To modern readers, hail may not sound especially unusual. Many countries experience severe hailstorms every year, but Egypt is different. Most of the country is extremely dry. Rain itself is relatively uncommon across much of the Nile Valley, especially compared to neighboring regions farther north. A violent hailstorm powerful enough to destroy agriculture would have been an unforgettable event. This raises an important question. Could such a storm actually occur? Meteorologists say yes. Although rare, powerful thunderstorms can develop in Egypt under unusual atmospheric conditions. Modern weather records include examples of destructive hailstorms causing serious damage in parts of the country. Climate patterns occasionally shift in ways that allow cold, upper-level air to collide with warm, moisture-rich air rising from lower altitudes. When this happens, large hailstones can form surprisingly quickly. In recent years, several parts of Egypt have even experienced unexpected snowfall and severe hail, events that many residents considered extraordinary. If such storms can occur today, they were certainly possible thousands of years ago under exceptional climatic conditions. Some researchers believe that large volcanic eruptions could have increased atmospheric instability across the eastern Mediterranean. Again, the eruption of Thera often enters the discussion. Volcanic eruptions release enormous amounts of ash and gases into the atmosphere. These particles influence weather patterns, sometimes leading to cooler temperatures, unusual rainfall, and severe storms far from the volcano itself. While the exact timing remains debated, scientists agree that massive eruptions can alter regional climates for years. Whether or not Thera was connected to the Exodus, it demonstrates that ancient weather could become far more unpredictable than people often imagine. The biblical account contains another fascinating detail. Moses reportedly warned the Egyptians before the storm arrived. Those who believed the warning brought their bees, servants, and livestock indoors. Those who ignored it suffered heavy losses. This small detail gives the narrative an unexpected realism. Instead of presenting the storm as random destruction, it describes people making decisions based on the information available to them. Some listened, others did not. The consequences were dramatically different. For historians, such details often make ancient narratives feel less like legends and more like remembered experiences shaped through storytelling. Exodus also notes that not every crop was destroyed equally. Flax and barley were ruined because they had already matured. Wheat and spelt survived because they ripened later. This agricultural observation has attracted considerable attention. Botanists point out that these crops do indeed mature at different times of the growing season. The description fits Egyptian agriculture remarkably well. It also provides historians with clues about the possible season during which these events were believed to have occurred. Small details like these cannot prove the story. However, they demonstrate a surprisingly accurate knowledge of Egyptian farming practices. Once the storm ended, Pharaoh appeared to change. For the first time, he openly admitted wrongdoing. "I have sinned this time," he reportedly declared. He acknowledged that the Lord was righteous and promised to release the Israelites if the storm stopped. Moses prayed, the thunder ceased, the hail ended. The skies cleared. But as soon as the immediate danger passed, Pharaoh changed his mind once again. This pattern has become familiar. Crisis, temporary repentance, relief, renewed resistance. Many historians recognize similar behavior during real disasters.
Leaders often promise reforms while danger is immediate. Once conditions improve, old habits return. Whether interpreted historically or theologically, Pharaoh's actions reflect a deeply human tendency. As difficult as the hailstorm had been, another problem now emerged. The damaged fields contained whatever crops had survived. Broken plants lay scattered across the land. Fresh vegetation began growing wherever possible. It was exactly the kind of environment that attracts one of agriculture's oldest enemies, locusts. The next plague would not destroy crops with ice. Instead, it would consume everything the hail had left behind. Locust swarms are among the most destructive natural disasters known to humanity. Unlike ordinary grasshoppers, locusts can undergo remarkable behavioral changes under certain environmental conditions. When population density becomes high enough, their bodies actually change. They gather into enormous swarms capable of traveling hundreds of miles. Modern science has documented swarms containing billions of insects. Some have covered hundreds of square miles. They darken the sky. They strip fields bare within hours. Trees lose every leaf. Farmers watch entire harvests disappear before their eyes. Nothing in the ancient world could stop them. Even today, modern governments equipped with aircraft and pesticides struggle to control major outbreaks. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations regularly monitors locust populations because they remain one of the world's greatest agricultural threats. Historical records from Africa, the Middle East, and Asia describe famines caused by locust invasions. Entire civilizations feared them. Ancient Egypt was no exception. The environmental sequence once again appears logical. Heavy rains or flooding often create ideal breeding conditions for locusts. Vegetation grows rapidly. Populations increase. When food becomes scarce, the insects gather into migrating swarms, searching for new feeding grounds. Researchers studying climate history recognize that severe storms followed by locust outbreaks are not unusual. The Exodus narrative continues following an ecological progression that modern scientists understand remarkably well. Before the locusts arrived, Pharaoh's advisors finally reached their limit. They urged him to surrender. Their words revealed the desperation, spreading through the royal court. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined? It is one of the most striking statements in the entire Exodus story. The officials no longer debated theology. They focused on survival. Their country was collapsing. Fields had failed. Animals had died. Disease had spread. The economy was crumbling. Every delay increased the disaster. Pharaoh briefly negotiated with Moses, attempting to compromise by allowing only certain Israelites to leave. Moses refused. The demand remained unchanged. Everyone must go. Once again, Pharaoh hardened his position. Then the wind changed. According to Exodus, an east wind blew across Egypt throughout the day and into the night. By morning, the locusts had arrived. The description is dramatic. The insects covered the ground until it became impossible to see the earth beneath them. They consumed every remaining green plant. Fruit disappeared from the trees.
nothing alive remained in the fields. Whether understood as divine judgment or an extraordinary natural disaster, the result was the same. Egypt now faced the terrifying possibility of famine. Food reserves would become increasingly important. Prices would rise. Trade would suffer. Ordinary families would wonder how they would survive the coming months. The nation that had once been the breadbasket of the ancient Near East now stood on the edge of agricultural catastrophe. Yet according to the biblical narrative, an even stranger event was still to come. The next plague would not attack the land, the crops, or the animals. By the time the locusts disappeared, Egypt had reached a breaking point. The fertile fields that had once stretched across the Nile Valley now stood nearly empty. What the hail had damaged, the locusts had consumed. The country that depended on agriculture for survival suddenly faced an uncertain future. For most civilizations of the ancient world, a failed harvest meant hardship. For Egypt, it threatened the stability of an entire empire. Yet according to the book of Exodus, Pharaoh still refused to release the Israelites. Then came one of the most mysterious plagues of all. Without warning, darkness covered Egypt. Exodus describes it as a darkness so thick that it could almost be felt. For 3 days, people were unable to see one another. Many remained where they were, unable or unwilling to move. Daily life came to a complete standstill. This description has fascinated historians and scientists for centuries because it differs from an ordinary night. The Bible is not simply describing sunset. It speaks of an oppressive darkness that remained during the day. What could cause such an event? One explanation often discussed involves massive dust storms. Egypt is no stranger to powerful desert winds. Even today, the Khamsin winds sweep across North Africa, carrying enormous amounts of dust and sand. During particularly severe storms, visibility can fall to only a few meters. The sun becomes little more than a faint orange circle, and daytime begins to resemble twilight. Travel becomes dangerous. Breathing becomes difficult. People often remain indoors until the storm passes. Modern photographs of these storms look almost surreal. Entire cities disappear behind walls of dust. Could an unusually intense sandstorm explain the 9th plague? Perhaps, but there is a problem. Most dust storms last for hours rather than several consecutive days. While some weather systems can linger, many researchers believe another possibility deserves attention. Volcanic ash. Large volcanic eruptions can inject billions of tons of ash high into the atmosphere. Depending on wind direction, this ash can travel hundreds or even thousands of miles. Regions far from the eruption may experience darkened skies, cooler temperatures, and poor visibility for extended periods. Again, the eruption of Thera becomes part of the discussion. Although scholars continue debating its exact date, there is no doubt about its enormous power. Geological evidence shows that the explosion was among the largest volcanic events of the Bronze Age. Ash from Thera has been found across parts of the eastern Mediterranean. If atmospheric conditions were favorable, fine volcanic particles could have contributed to unusually dark skies over distant regions.
Whether this happened during the time of the Exodus remains uncertain. Still, it demonstrates that nature is capable of producing extraordinary darkness without violating known physical laws. Some researchers have proposed a combination of volcanic ash and desert dust. Together, they could have created a dense atmospheric haze, unlike anything people normally experienced. Imagine standing outside at midday. The familiar blue sky has vanished. The sun barely penetrates the thick cloud overhead. The air tastes dry. Every breath carries fine particles. Light fades until the landscape seems frozen in an endless twilight. Ancient people would almost certainly have interpreted such an event as supernatural. There is another fascinating layer to this plague. Ancient Egyptian religion placed enormous importance on the sun. The sun god Ra stood among the most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. Each morning, Egyptians believed Ra traveled across the sky, bringing light and maintaining cosmic order. Without his daily journey, chaos would overwhelm the world. Now imagine several days in which the sun failed to appear. For ordinary Egyptians, this would have been terrifying. Was Ra defeated? Had the gods abandoned Egypt? Or was another power demonstrating authority over the heavens themselves? From a theological perspective, the biblical narrative presents the darkness as a direct challenge to Egypt's greatest religious symbol. Whether one accepts this interpretation or not, it is impossible to ignore the symbolic power of the story. The nation that worshipped the sun suddenly found itself unable to see it. Meanwhile, Exodus reports that the Israelites still had light where they lived. As with several earlier plagues, the narrative emphasizes a distinction between Egypt and the Hebrew population. Historians cannot verify this detail archaeologically, but within the structure of the biblical account it reinforces the central message. The disasters are not random accidents, but purposeful events. Pharaoh's reaction reveals how desperate the situation had become. For the first time, he came very close to agreement. He told Moses that the Israelites could leave. But there was one condition. Their livestock must remain behind. To Pharaoh, this was practical. Animals represented wealth. If the people left without them, they would eventually have to return. Moses refused. The Israelites would take everything with them. Not a single hoof would remain in Egypt. Negotiations collapsed. Pharaoh's patience finally broke. According to Exodus, he ordered Moses to leave his presence and warned that if they met again, Moses would die. Moses answered calmly, "You are right, I will never appear before you again." Those words mark a dramatic turning point. I will never appear before you again. Those words mark a dramatic turning point. The long series of warnings had come to an end. There would be no more negotiations, no more compromises, no more opportunities for Pharaoh to reconsider. Only one plague remained. It would become the most tragic and controversial event in the entire Exodus narrative. Before examining that final plague, historians pause to consider the remarkable pattern that has emerged. The sequence began with water. It spread to animals, then insects, disease,
weather, agriculture, and finally the sky itself. Every part of Egypt's natural world had been affected, whether interpreted as miraculous judgment, an extraordinary environmental chain reaction, or a combination of both. The progression is strikingly systematic. Modern researchers often describe disasters as compound events. One crisis weakens society. A second follows before recovery begins. A third overwhelms remaining resources. Eventually, even a powerful civilization struggles to cope. Ancient Egypt was one of the strongest empires on earth. Yet according to the biblical account, it had been brought to the edge of collapse not by invading armies, but by a relentless sequence of disasters. The greatest test, however, had not yet arrived. The final plague would not target rivers, crops, livestock, insects, or weather. It would strike Egyptian families themselves. It would become the event forever remembered through the institution of Passover, one of history's oldest, continuously observed religious commemorations. Whether viewed through faith, history, or archaeology, the story of the 10th plague remains one of the most profound and emotionally challenging passages in the entire Bible. After 9 devastating plagues, Egypt was no longer the prosperous empire it had once been. The river that had sustained the kingdom had become a source of fear. Livestock had perished, crops had been destroyed, disease had spread through the land, darkness had covered the nation. Every warning Moses delivered had been ignored, and every opportunity Pharaoh had been given had ended the same way. Now the story reached its most dramatic and most difficult moment. Unlike the previous plagues, the 10th plague was not directed at nature. It was directed at people. According to the book of Exodus, Moses delivered one final warning. Around midnight, the firstborn in every Egyptian household would die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the lowest servant. Even the firstborn of livestock would not be spared. Only the Israelite homes, marked with the blood of a sacrificed lamb, would be passed over. This event became the foundation of one of the most important observances in Jewish history, Passover. For thousands of years, Jewish families have remembered that night by sharing a ceremonial meal and retelling the story of deliverance from Egypt. From a historical perspective, however, the 10th plague raises profound questions. Why the firstborn? Could there be any natural explanation? Or does the story belong entirely to the realm of divine intervention? Many scholars agree on one point. Unlike several earlier plagues, the 10th plague is extremely difficult to explain through ordinary environmental processes alone. Nevertheless, a number of theories have been proposed. One suggestion involves contaminated grain. Imagine the situation Egypt faced after months of ecological disaster. Floodwaters had become polluted. Dead animals had contaminated the environment. Harvests had largely failed. Whatever grain remained would have been stored carefully, often under conditions that encouraged mold or bacterial growth. Some molds produce deadly toxins. If contaminated grain entered the food supply, illness could spread rapidly. But why would the firstborn be affected more than anyone else? One theory suggests that in many ancient households, the eldest son traditionally received the first or largest portion of food. If the grain had been contaminated, the firstborn might have consumed a greater amount than others. It is an interesting idea. However, there is very little direct evidence supporting it, and many historians consider it speculative. Another theory points to carbon dioxide or other poisonous gases. Natural gases can accumulate in low-lying areas under unusual geological conditions. If people slept close to the floor while others rested higher above the ground, some individuals might have been affected more severely. Yet this explanation also struggles to account for the specific pattern described in Exodus. The biblical account is highly selective. It identifies the firstborn, not people based on where they slept. Because of these difficulties, many historians conclude that no known natural process fully explains the 10th plague. For believers, this is precisely the point. The final plague is presented not as an ecological disaster, but as a direct act of divine judgment. Whether one accepts that conclusion depends largely upon one's understanding of miracles. Ancient Egyptians would have experienced the event as overwhelming. Imagine waking in the middle of the night to cries echoing across every neighborhood. Families rushing through dark streets. Royal messengers racing towards the palace. Temples filled with desperate prayers. The silence that followed the earlier darkness had now been replaced by grief. Exodus describes a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. It is one of the most haunting lines in the entire Bible. At last Pharaoh surrendered. He summoned Moses and Aaron before dawn. His command was simple. Leave. Take your people. Take your livestock. Go and worship your God. According to the biblical narrative, the Israelites departed so quickly that they did not have time for their bread to rise. Instead, they carried unleavened dough with them. This became another lasting symbol of Passover. Even today, unleavened bread, known as matzah, remains central to the celebration. Historians have long searched for Egyptian records describing such a catastrophe. None has been found. Critics often point to this silence as evidence against the Exodus. But Egyptologists caution against drawing quick conclusions. Ancient Egyptian royal inscriptions were not objective history books. They functioned as political propaganda. Victories were celebrated, triumphs were exaggerated, defeats were minimized or ignored. There are many examples throughout Egyptian history where major military failures were either softened or omitted entirely from official monuments. If an event deeply humiliated Pharaoh and challenged the authority of Egypt's gods, would royal scribes have preserved it for future generations? Many historians believe that is unlikely. Instead, researchers continue examining indirect evidence. Some archaeological sites reveal periods of social disruption. Others show signs of abandonment or economic decline. Climate studies point to episodes of environmental instability during different periods of Egyptian history. None of these discoveries proves the Exodus. Neither do they disprove it. They simply remind us that reconstructing events
from over 3,000 years ago is extraordinarily difficult. Another ancient document frequently discussed is the Ipuwer papyrus. Although its date remains debated, it describes Egypt overwhelmed by chaos. It speaks of servants leaving, widespread death, and the river appearing like blood. Some writers claim this document independently confirms the biblical plagues. Most Egyptologists disagree. They argue that the surviving manuscript is a literary composition copied centuries later and cannot be treated as a direct eyewitness account. Still, the similarities continue to spark discussion. Whether coincidence, shared memory, or literary tradition remains uncertain. One of the greatest challenges facing historians is distinguishing between historical memory and theological storytelling. Ancient cultures rarely separated the two. When extraordinary events occurred, they interpreted them through the lens of religion. A famine became divine judgment. A victory became divine favor. A plague became a message from heaven. This does not automatically make the events imaginary. It simply reflects the worldview of the people who recorded them. Modern readers sometimes expect history to resemble a newspaper report. Ancient history rarely works that way. It combines observation, interpretation, symbolism, and memory into a single narrative. Perhaps that is why the Exodus continues to inspire debate after thousands of years. It stands at the crossroads of archaeology, religion, climatology, history, and human belief. Each discipline asks different questions. Each uncovers different kinds of evidence, yet none possesses every answer. As Pharaoh watched the Israelites prepare to leave, he may have believed the crisis was finally over. But according to the Bible, the story of the plagues was not yet complete. One final chapter remained. The escape from Egypt would lead to one of history's most famous miracles, the crossing of the Red Sea. The morning after the 10th plague, Egypt was transformed. Only days earlier, Pharaoh had stubbornly refused every request Moses made. Now everything had changed. According to the book of Exodus, the Israelites gathered their families, their livestock, and whatever belongings they could carry. There was little time to prepare. The departure happened with remarkable speed, as if everyone understood that waiting even a few more hours could change everything. For the first time in generations, the Israelites were no longer preparing to work as slaves. They were preparing to leave Egypt behind. The Bible describes Egyptian families urging them to go quickly. Fear had replaced resistance. Many Egyptians reportedly gave the departing Israelites silver, gold, and clothing, believing that if they delayed, even greater disaster might follow. From a historical perspective, this moment raises another fascinating question. Did a large population really leave Egypt? Estimating the number of Israelites has challenged scholars for centuries. The book of Exodus mentions around 600,000 adult men, which would imply a total population of well over 2 million people when women and children are included. Many historians consider that number difficult to reconcile with what is known about the population of ancient Egypt and the logistics of moving such an enormous group
through the wilderness because of this. Several scholars argue that the Hebrew word translated as thousand may have had more than one meaning in ancient usage. In some contexts, it may have referred to a clan, military unit, or family group rather than exactly 1,000 individuals. If so, the total number of Israelites could have been much smaller than many traditional estimates. Others maintain that the biblical figures should be understood literally. The debate remains unresolved. Regardless of the exact population, organizing any large migration across the Sinai region would have been a tremendous challenge. Food had to be carried. Water had to be located. Children and elderly people required protection. Livestock needed grazing land. Every decision affected the survival of the entire community. Archaeologists have searched the Sinai Peninsula for direct evidence of such a migration. This has proven difficult. The harsh desert environment constantly reshapes the landscape. Wind erases footprints. Seasonal floods wash away campsites. Nomadic groups often leave very little behind for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. The absence of extensive archaeological remains has therefore become one of the central arguments used by skeptics. Supporters of the Exodus respond that expecting clear evidence from temporary desert camps occupied more than 3,000 years ago may not be realistic. Even modern expeditions sometimes leave surprisingly little trace after only a few decades. As with many aspects of the Exodus, the evidence remains open to interpretation. The biblical narrative then takes another unexpected turn. After allowing the Israelites to leave, Pharaoh began to reconsider. Perhaps the emotional shock of the 10th plague slowly gave way to political reality. Egypt had lost an enormous labor force. Its economy had already suffered repeated disasters. Now thousands of workers were gone. According to Exodus, Pharaoh assembled his chariots and set out in pursuit. This moment reveals something important about ancient Egypt. Its military was among the most advanced in the ancient world. Egyptian chariots were fast, highly maneuverable, and feared across the Near East. Elite chariot units often decided the outcome of battles. Against such a force, a large group of former slaves would appear almost defenseless. The Israelites soon found themselves trapped. Ahead lay a large body of water. Behind them approached Pharaoh's army. The people panicked. Some questioned whether leaving Egypt had been a mistake. Others blamed Moses for leading them into what seemed like an impossible situation. It is a deeply human reaction. Hope can disappear quickly when fear takes control. Moses answered with words that have echoed through history. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. Then comes one of the Bible's most famous miracles. The waters divided. The Israelites crossed on dry ground. When the Egyptian army followed, the waters returned, overwhelming Pharaoh's chariots. For believers, this event represents one of the greatest demonstrations of divine power in Scripture. For historians and scientists, it has become one of the most intensely debated episodes in biblical history. The first question concerns location. The English phrase Red Sea comes from ancient Greek translations of the Bible. However, the original Hebrew text uses the expression Yam Suf, often translated as the Sea of Reeds. Some scholars argue this refers not to the modern Red Sea, but to a network of shallow lakes and marshes that once existed in the eastern Nile Delta. If that interpretation is correct, the crossing may have occurred in a different location than traditionally imagined. Geologists have proposed several fascinating natural explanations. One involves a phenomenon known as wind set-down. Powerful, sustained winds blowing across shallow water can temporarily push water away from one area, exposing land beneath. Computer simulations have demonstrated that under very specific conditions, a strong east wind lasting several hours could create a temporary land bridge across certain shallow lakes. Once the wind stopped, the water would rapidly return. Remarkably, Exodus mentions that the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind all night. Some researchers believe this detail deserves serious scientific attention. Others argue that even if such a mechanism is possible, it cannot fully explain every aspect of the biblical account. The timing alone would have been extraordinary. The Israelites would have needed to arrive precisely when the waters receded. The Egyptian army would have entered at exactly the wrong moment. For many believers, such timing itself would point to divine intervention. Science may explain the physical mechanism. Faith addresses why it happened when it did. This distinction lies at the heart of many discussions surrounding the Exodus. Interestingly, modern computer models have shown that ancient weather patterns could indeed produce temporary land crossings in certain shallow coastal environments. These studies do not prove the biblical event occurred exactly as described. They simply demonstrate that nature sometimes behaves in ways that ancient observers would naturally regard as miraculous. History repeatedly reminds us that extraordinary events often arise from a combination of natural processes and remarkable timing. Whether the crossing was entirely supernatural, partly explained by unusual environmental conditions, or remembered through centuries of storytelling, it remains one of the defining moments in biblical tradition. For the Israelites, it marked the end of slavery. For Egypt, it marked the end of pursuit. And for future generations, it became a symbol of freedom, deliverance, and hope against impossible odds. Yet the journey was far from over. Leaving Egypt proved easier than surviving the wilderness. The crossing of the sea marked the end of one chapter, but it also began another. For generations, the Israelites had lived within one of the richest civilizations in the ancient world. Egypt's fertile Nile Valley provided water, food, and shelter despite the hardships of slavery. Now, according to the biblical narrative, they found themselves surrounded by an unforgiving wilderness. The desert is beautiful from a distance. Its endless horizons, golden dunes, and rocky mountains inspire awe. But beneath that beauty lies one of the harshest environments on Earth. Water is scarce. Temperatures rise dramatically during the day and fall sharply at night. Vegetation is limited, and survival depends on careful planning. For a large group of travelers, every day became a challenge. The book of Exodus describes how the Israelites soon began to complain. Their excitement after escaping Egypt slowly gave way to exhaustion. Families searched for water. Livestock needed grazing land. Children grew hungry. Many wondered whether freedom had come at too high a price. These details often receive less attention than the dramatic miracles, yet they give the narrative a surprisingly human quality. People who have experienced long migrations throughout history often report similar emotions: relief, hope, uncertainty, fear, doubt. The Exodus reflects this emotional cycle repeatedly. One question frequently asked by historians is whether archaeological evidence supports the Israelites' journey through the wilderness. The answer is complicated. Over the past century, archaeologists have surveyed large portions of the Sinai Peninsula. They have discovered ancient mining sites, trade routes, military outposts, and temporary camps used by nomadic peoples. However, clear evidence for a massive Israelite encampment lasting decades has remained elusive. Some scholars see this as a major challenge to the traditional understanding of the Exodus. Others caution against expecting too much. Nomadic groups rarely build permanent structures. They travel with tents, temporary shelters, and portable possessions. Wind, erosion, seasonal floods, and thousands of years of natural change can erase much of what they leave behind. Even today, modern desert camps may disappear within surprisingly short periods. Another important factor is geography. Researchers still debate the exact route taken by the Israelites. Several possible paths have been proposed. Some favor a northern route near the Mediterranean coast. Others support a central route through the Sinai. Still others suggest a southern journey toward the mountainous regions traditionally associated with Mount Sinai. Without agreement on the route, archaeologists face an enormous challenge. Searching the wrong location may naturally produce disappointing results. This uncertainty reminds us that ancient history often contains many unanswered questions. The Bible next describes one of the most famous episodes of the wilderness journey. The people arrived at a place called Marah. They found water, but there was a problem. The water was bitter and undrinkable. Once again, complaints spread throughout the camp. Moses prayed, and according to Exodus, God showed him a piece of wood. When it was thrown into the water became fit to drink. Can science offer any possible explanation? Hydrologists note that certain natural water sources contain high concentrations of minerals that make them unpleasant or unsafe to drink. In some cases, flowing water mixes with fresh springs, changing its quality over time. A few researchers have even suggested that certain plants or types of wood could affect small bodies of water under limited circumstances, though none provides a complete explanation matching the biblical account. Whether miracle or natural event, the story emphasizes a recurring theme. Every crisis becomes another test of trust. Soon, another problem emerged. Food supplies began running low. According to Exodus, The Israelites longed for the meals they remembered from Egypt. Memory can be selective during difficult times. People often forget past suffering while remembering familiar comforts. The Bible portrays exactly this tendency. Former slaves began speaking nostalgically about life in Egypt, despite the hardships they had endured there. In response, the narrative introduces another miracle. Each morning, a mysterious substance appeared on the ground. The Israelites called it manna, a word traditionally understood to mean something like, "What is it?" The description is fascinating. It appeared with the morning dew. It resembled small white flakes. People gathered only enough for each day. If they tried to store extra, it spoiled, except before the Sabbath when it remained fresh. Scientists have proposed several natural possibilities. One suggestion involves sweet secretions produced by insects feeding on tamarisk trees in parts of the Sinai. These tiny droplets harden overnight and can be collected early in the morning before melting in the heat. Another theory points to edible lichens carried by desert winds. Neither explanation perfectly matches the biblical description. The quantities required to feed a large population would be far greater than those produced naturally today. Still, such discoveries demonstrate that unusual edible substances do exist in desert environments. Again, the discussion returns to the relationship between natural processes and divine timing. Many believers see no contradiction. If God used natural resources in extraordinary ways at precisely the right moment, the event remains miraculous. History often forces us to consider both perspectives. Water soon became scarce once more. At a place called Rephidim, the people again feared they would die of thirst. According to Exodus, Moses struck a rock with his staff, and water flowed from it. For centuries, travelers have searched for rocks in the Sinai capable of producing water. Some geological formations contain hidden underground reservoirs. Heavy seasonal rains may become trapped within fractured stone before emerging through cracks under pressure, yet the scale described in Exodus would require an extraordinary amount of water. Whether miracle or natural phenomenon, the account reflects the constant struggle for survival in one of the world's driest regions. The wilderness journey also transformed the Israelites spiritually. They were no longer merely escaping slavery. They were becoming a nation. Laws would soon be given, a covenant would be established, their identity would be reshaped. This transition helps explain why the Exodus occupies such a central place in Jewish, Christian, and even Islamic tradition. It is more than an escape story. It is the birth of a people. Modern archaeology continues adding small pieces to this enormous puzzle. Ancient inscriptions mentioning groups called the Shasu. Egyptian records referring to Semitic workers. Evidence of population movements throughout the Late Bronze Age. None alone proves the Exodus. Together, they paint a picture of a region where migration, conflict, and cultural interaction were common realities. Perhaps that is why the Exodus story continues to fascinate scholars. It exists within a historical world that archaeology increasingly understands, even if these specific events remain debated. The wilderness was preparing the Israelites for something even greater.
Ahead lay a mountain where, according to the Bible, heaven and earth would seem to meet. Thunder, fire, smoke. A covenant unlike any the ancient world had ever known. As the Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, they eventually arrived at the foot of a mountain that would become one of the most significant locations in religious history. The Bible calls it Mount Sinai, the place where Moses would receive the Ten Commandments and where the covenant between God and Israel would be established. Yet despite its importance, one of the greatest mysteries remains surprisingly simple. Where exactly is Mount Sinai? For centuries, pilgrims have traveled to Jebel Musa in Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, the traditional location identified by early Christian monks during the 4th century AD. Today, thousands of visitors climb the mountain every year, especially before sunrise, believing it to be the biblical site. However, not all historians agree. Several alternative locations have been proposed. Some researchers point to mountains farther north. Others argue for sites in northwestern Saudi Arabia. Each theory relies on different interpretations of biblical geography, ancient trade routes, and archaeological evidence. So far, no location has gained universal acceptance. This uncertainty reminds us that ancient history often leaves room for continued discovery. According to Exodus, the mountain became surrounded by thunder, lightning, smoke, and fire. A loud trumpet-like sound echoed across the landscape while the ground itself trembled. To ancient witnesses, the scene represented the visible presence of God. Modern scientists have wondered whether natural phenomena may also have contributed to these descriptions. Volcanic activity has sometimes been suggested because volcanoes produce smoke, fire, loud noises, and earthquakes. Yet there is a significant problem. No active volcano is known to have existed in the traditional Sinai Peninsula during the relevant period. This has led some researchers supporting Arabian locations to investigate volcanic regions farther east. Even there, however, definitive evidence remains lacking. Others suggest that powerful thunderstorms, combined with earthquakes, could explain many of the reported phenomena. The Middle East lies within a tectonically active region where earthquakes have occurred throughout recorded history. Thunderstorms in mountainous areas can also create dramatic displays of lightning, echoing sounds, and thick clouds. Again, science offers possible mechanisms without claiming certainty. For believers, the central message remains theological rather than geological. The mountain represents the moment when a newly freed people entered into a covenant with God. The Ten Commandments became the foundation for much of Western moral and legal tradition. Regardless of one's religious beliefs, their historical influence is undeniable. As historians examine the Exodus narrative, an important question emerges. Did later generations preserve these stories accurately, or were they gradually reshaped over centuries? Ancient cultures relied heavily on oral tradition before many texts were written down. Modern research into oral cultures has shown that important traditions can remain remarkably stable when communities treat them as sacred. At the same time, storytelling naturally includes
interpretation and emphasis. This means historical memory and theological meaning often become intertwined. The Exodus is likely no exception. Archaeology provides another valuable perspective. Although direct evidence for every event remains elusive, discoveries continue to confirm many details about the broader world described in the Bible. Ancient Egyptian cities mentioned in Scripture have been identified. Semitic populations are known to have lived and worked in Egypt. Trade routes through Sinai are well documented. Political conditions described in late Bronze Age records often align with the general historical setting reflected in Exodus. These discoveries do not prove every miracle occurred exactly as described. They do demonstrate that the biblical narrative unfolds within a genuine historical landscape rather than an imaginary world. This distinction is important. History and faith are not always asking the same questions. Historians ask what can be demonstrated through evidence. Theology asks what those events mean. Sometimes the two overlap. Sometimes they address entirely different aspects of the same story. The 10 plagues illustrate this perfectly. Science can investigate red algae, insect outbreaks, livestock disease, severe weather, volcanic ash, and ecological collapse. Archaeology can examine settlements, climate records, and ancient documents. Neither discipline can directly measure divine purpose. That question belongs to philosophy and religion. One of the most remarkable features of the plague narrative is its internal consistency. From beginning to end, the disasters unfold in an escalating sequence. The Nile is affected first, then wildlife, and then insects, disease, agriculture, weather, darkness. Finally, human tragedy. Modern disaster researchers often describe this as a cascading crisis, where one disruption weakens society until the next becomes even more destructive. Whether viewed as miraculous judgment or an extraordinary chain of natural events, guided by divine timing, the progression displays a logical structure that continues to impress scholars. Another fascinating aspect is the resilience of the story itself. For more than 3,000 years, people have debated, studied, questioned, defended, and retold the account of the plagues. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have changed. Civilizations have disappeared. Yet the Exodus narrative continues to be read in synagogues, churches, universities, museums, and archaeological expeditions around the world. Very few ancient stories have exercised such lasting influence. Perhaps that is because the Exodus speaks to universal human experiences: oppression, hope, freedom, fear, leadership, faith, justice, survival. These themes remain relevant in every generation. Whether someone approaches the Bible as sacred scripture, historical literature, or a cultural masterpiece, the questions raised by the plagues remain deeply compelling. Did extraordinary natural disasters inspire the story? Did divine intervention work through natural events? Or did something occur that lies beyond ordinary historical explanation? No single answer satisfies everyone. And perhaps that is part of what makes the mystery endure. As our exploration of the biblical plagues approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. After centuries of archaeological discoveries, scientific advances, and historical research, what can we honestly say about the evidence? What has been confirmed? What remains uncertain? And what mysteries continue to challenge historians today? By now, we have explored the biblical account from multiple perspectives. We have examined the Nile turning red, the invasion of frogs, the explosion of insects, the spread of disease, the devastating hailstorm, the locust invasion, the mysterious darkness, and the final plague that changed the course of Egyptian history forever. We have compared biblical descriptions with archaeology, climatology, geology, medicine, and ecology. But one question still remains. If the Exodus really happened, why is there so little direct Egyptian evidence? This is perhaps the most common question asked by both skeptics and believers. At first glance, it seems like a fair criticism. Egypt was one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. It produced thousands of inscriptions, temple carvings, royal monuments, administrative records, and papyrus documents. If 10 catastrophic plagues devastated the country, shouldn't there be a detailed Egyptian account describing them? The answer is not as simple as many people assume. Ancient Egypt was not a modern society with independent historians and newspapers. Almost everything officially written about the pharaohs served a political purpose. Royal inscriptions existed to glorify the king. Temple walls celebrated victories. Military campaigns were exaggerated. Enemies were defeated again and again in official records, even when historical evidence suggests a much more complicated reality. Historians have discovered several examples where Egyptian rulers completely ignored major defeats. One famous case involves military campaigns in the Near East. While neighboring civilizations described Egyptian setbacks, official Egyptian monuments often remained silent or presented the events as victories. This practice was common throughout the ancient world. Kings did not commission monuments to celebrate failure. They commissioned monuments to strengthen their authority. If Pharaoh had suffered the greatest national disaster in Egyptian history, would royal scribes have eagerly recorded it? Most Egyptologists think that is highly unlikely. Silence, therefore, is not necessarily proof that nothing happened. It may simply reflect the political culture of the time. Another important consideration is the survival of ancient documents. Only a tiny fraction of Egypt's written records still exists today. Papyrus is fragile. Fire destroys it. Floods damage it. Insects consume it. Thousands of years of natural decay have erased countless documents forever. Imagine trying to reconstruct the history of an entire modern nation using less than 1% of its official records. That is the challenge historians face with ancient Egypt. Every archaeological discovery represents only a small surviving piece of a much larger puzzle. The famous Ipuwer papyrus is often mentioned in discussions of the Exodus. The text describes a land in chaos. It speaks of servants leaving their masters. It describes widespread suffering. One line even refers to the river as blood. To many readers, the similarities seem astonishing.
However, professional Egyptologists urge caution. The surviving manuscript is a copy made centuries after the period it may describe. It belongs to a literary tradition rather than an official historical report. This does not mean the document is useless. It simply means it cannot be treated as direct proof of the biblical plagues. Still, it reminds us that ancient Egyptians themselves preserved stories about times of national catastrophe. Another intriguing discovery comes from climate science. Over the last few decades, researchers have examined ice cores, tree rings, lake sediments, and cave formations to reconstruct ancient weather patterns. These natural archives reveal periods of severe drought, volcanic eruptions, and sudden climate change across the eastern Mediterranean. Some of these environmental disruptions occurred during periods broadly compatible with proposed dates for the Exodus. Again, the evidence is not conclusive, but it demonstrates that the ancient world experienced dramatic environmental crises capable of affecting entire civilizations. Perhaps the greatest lesson archaeology has taught us is humility. History is rarely as simple as we would like. Every discovery answers one question while creating several new ones. For much of the 19th century, many scholars doubt the existence of several biblical cities because no archaeological evidence had yet been found. Later excavations confirmed many of them. Likewise, ancient rulers once dismissed as legendary eventually appeared in inscriptions buried beneath the earth for thousands of years. This does not prove every biblical event. It does remind us that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. Some discoveries simply require time. Others may never be found. There is another aspect of the plague narrative that often receives less attention: its remarkable literary structure. The 10 plagues are not arranged randomly. Many biblical scholars observe patterns within the sequence. Some plagues affect the environment. Others affect animals. Others directly affect people. Warnings are sometimes given. Other plagues arrive without warning. The narrative builds steadily toward its emotional climax. Whether one believes the account is historical, theological, or both, its composition reflects extraordinary care. This suggests that whoever preserved these traditions intended them to communicate more than a simple list of disasters. They were telling a story about justice, about power, about freedom, and about the consequences of refusing repeated opportunities to change. Perhaps that message explains why the Exodus has remained relevant for thousands of years. Generations facing oppression have found hope in it. Religious communities have built rituals around it. Artists have painted it. Musicians have composed works inspired by it. Filmmakers have retold it. Historians continue debating it. Scientists continue investigating it. Few ancient events have generated such lasting fascination. As our journey continues, we are approaching the conclusion. The final chapter will bring together everything we have learned. We will separate what historians generally agree upon from what remains uncertain. We will examine the strongest evidence, both supporting and challenging the historical reliability of the biblical plagues. And finally, we will ask the question that has inspired this entire investigation. After centuries of research, how close are we to discovering the historical truth behind one of the Bible's greatest mysteries? As our investigation moves closer to its conclusion, it is worth stepping back from individual plagues and looking at the bigger picture. Historians often remind us that a single piece of evidence rarely solves an ancient mystery. Instead, they collect hundreds of small clues, compare them carefully, and build the most reasonable explanation possible. The story of the biblical plagues is no different. There is no ancient inscription that simply says, "The 10 plagues happened exactly as the book of Exodus describes." At the same time, there is also no archaeological discovery proving that the entire story was invented. Instead, researchers find themselves somewhere between certainty and uncertainty, a place where history often lives. One of the strongest observations made by modern scientists is that the sequence of the first several plagues follows a surprisingly believable ecological pattern. If the Nile became polluted, fish would die. If fish died, frogs would abandon the river. If frogs disappeared, insect populations would increase rapidly. Those insects could spread diseases to livestock and humans. Agriculture would suffer. Food shortages would follow. This chain reaction is entirely consistent with how ecosystems behave today. Does that prove the biblical account? No. But it demonstrates that the sequence described in Exodus reflects genuine environmental logic rather than a random collection of disasters. Another important question concerns timing. Some researchers believe several natural disasters may have occurred over months or even years before later traditions combined them into a single dramatic narrative. Others argue that the events happened within a much shorter period, exactly as described in Scripture. Both possibilities remain under discussion. History often compresses events. Ancient storytellers focused on meaning as much as chronology. That makes reconstructing an exact timeline extremely difficult. The archaeological evidence itself presents a mixed picture. Excavations across Egypt continue revealing periods of environmental stress. Some settlements show signs of sudden decline. Others reveal changing river systems or interruptions in agricultural production. Climate studies identify episodes of drought and unusual flooding. Volcanic records confirm that enormous eruptions affected the eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. None of these discoveries alone proves the Exodus. Yet together they paint a picture of a region repeatedly shaped by natural catastrophe. This broader historical setting makes the biblical narrative easier to imagine within the realities of the ancient world. One of the greatest strengths of the Exodus story is that it takes place in a recognizable historical landscape. The cities, rivers, deserts, and neighboring kingdoms described throughout the narrative belong to the real world. Archaeology has confirmed countless details about everyday life in ancient Egypt that match the cultural background reflected in the Bible. Brickmaking, agricultural cycles, royal administration, trade routes,
religious practices. These details suggest that the writers possessed genuine knowledge of Egyptian civilization. Of course, knowing Egypt well does not automatically prove every event occurred exactly as recorded. But it does strengthen confidence that the narrative emerged from people familiar with that world. Another fascinating aspect is the role of memory. Modern psychology has shown that communities often preserve memories of extraordinary disasters for many generations. Floods, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, famines, wars. These events become part of cultural identity. Details may change over time, but the central memory often survives. Could the Exodus represent such a memory? Many scholars believe that possibility deserves serious consideration. Perhaps a real sequence of catastrophes became interpreted through the language of faith. Perhaps divine intervention worked through natural processes. Perhaps the events unfolded exactly as Scripture describes. Or perhaps the truth includes elements of all three. History cannot answer every theological question, nor can archaeology measure miracles. What it can do is investigate the world in which these stories were born. That investigation has revealed something remarkable. Far from existing in complete isolation, the biblical account repeatedly intersects with real geography, real cultures, real political systems, and real environmental processes. Those intersections explain why the debate continues. Believers often see confirmation. Skeptics see coincidence. Historians see an ancient puzzle still waiting to be solved. There is another lesson hidden within the plague narrative. Power is never permanent. At the beginning of Exodus, Pharaoh appears unstoppable. He commands armies, he controls wealth, he rules one of the greatest empires on earth. By the end of the story, however, even that immense power proves fragile. Whether interpreted spiritually or historically, the message remains timeless. No civilization, however strong, is completely beyond the reach of disaster. Ancient Egypt eventually declined. So did Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. History repeatedly reminds us that every empire is temporary. Perhaps that is one reason the Exodus continues speaking to people across different cultures and centuries. It is not only a story about ancient Egypt, it is a story about freedom overcoming oppression, hope overcoming fear, faith confronting impossible circumstances. These themes remain universal. As researchers continue excavating ancient sites and developing new scientific techniques, future discoveries may bring us closer to understanding what truly happened during the age traditionally associated with Moses. New inscriptions may be found. Improved dating methods may refine ancient chronologies. Hidden settlements may emerge beneath desert sands. History is never completely finished. Every generation asks new questions. Every generation uncovers new evidence. The mystery of the biblical plagues therefore remains alive, not because nothing has been discovered, but because every discovery invites us to look even deeper. We have traveled through one of history's greatest mysteries. We began beside the Nile River,
where the first plague transformed the lifeblood of Egypt into a symbol of disaster. We followed the frogs as they abandoned poisoned waters. We watched insects multiply across the land. Livestock fall to disease, hail destroy crops. Locusts consume what remained, darkness cover the nation, and finally the heartbreaking 10th plague that changed the course of biblical history forever. Along the way, we explored archaeology, climatology, geology, medicine, ecology, and ancient literature. Now, one final question remains. What can we honestly conclude? The most accurate answer is both simple and complex. There is no single archaeological discovery that proves the 10 plagues happened exactly as described in the book of Exodus. No Egyptian monument has been found saying that Pharaoh confronted Moses. No royal inscription lists the 10 plagues. No artifact has ended the debate once and for all. But that is only one side of the story. There is also no evidence proving that the Exodus narrative was completely invented. Instead, archaeologists continue uncovering details that support the historical setting in which the story takes place. Ancient Egyptian cities mentioned in the Bible existed. Semitic populations lived and worked in Egypt. Environmental disasters repeatedly affected the Nile Valley. Volcanic eruptions altered regional climates. Severe droughts, floods, epidemics, and crop failures are all historically documented realities of the ancient Near East. In other words, the world described in Exodus was very real. The greatest surprise for many researchers is the order of the plagues themselves. When viewed through modern environmental science, the first several plagues form a logical ecological chain reaction. Polluted water can kill fish. Dead fish drive frogs onto land. Dead frogs allow insect populations to explode. Insects spread disease. Disease affects livestock. Agricultural collapse follows. Food shortages become inevitable. This sequence is scientifically plausible. That does not prove the biblical account. But it does show that the narrative reflects a sophisticated understanding of how natural systems interact. Some scholars believe these disasters may have occurred naturally and were later understood as acts of divine judgment. Others believe God used natural processes at precisely the right time to accomplish his purpose. Still, others view the account primarily as sacred theological literature rather than literal history. Each interpretation has supporters. Each faces unanswered questions. The famous Ipuwer papyrus remains intriguing but inconclusive. The eruption of Thera remains scientifically important, but chronologically uncertain. The exact date of the Exodus continues to divide historians. The location of Mount Sinai remains debated. Even the crossing of the sea is interpreted differently by different researchers. History rarely provides perfect certainty. Instead, it invites us to examine evidence carefully, acknowledge uncertainty honestly, and remain open to future discoveries. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson archaeology teaches. Every generation believes it has answered history's biggest questions. Then a new excavation changes everything. An inscription appears beneath desert sand. A forgotten city is uncovered. A new dating method rewrites ancient chronology.
History is always evolving. The biblical plagues continue standing at the intersection of faith and science because both disciplines ask different questions. Science asks, how could this happen? History asks, what evidence survives? Faith asks, why did it happen? None of these questions cancels the others. Instead, together they create a richer understanding of one of humanity's oldest stories. Regardless of where someone stands on the question of miracles, the influence of the Exodus cannot be denied. For more than 3,000 years, it has inspired hope among the oppressed. It has shaped Jewish identity through Passover. It has influenced Christianity and Islam. It has inspired artists, musicians, filmmakers, historians, archaeologists, and scientists alike. Very few ancient narratives have left such a lasting mark on civilization. Perhaps the true power of the Exodus lies not only in whether every detail can be proven beyond doubt, but in the enduring questions it continues to raise. Can freedom overcome oppression? Can faith survive impossible circumstances? Can the most powerful empire on earth fall? History answers the last question with a remarkable consistency. Every empire eventually fades. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Each once believed its power would last forever. None did. The story of the plagues reminds us that even the greatest civilizations remain vulnerable to nature, to leadership, to circumstance, and, for believers, to the judgment of God. As archaeologists continue excavating Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, and the wider Near East, new discoveries will undoubtedly emerge. Some may strengthen traditional interpretations, others may challenge long-held assumptions. That is the nature of historical research. It is a journey rather than a destination. So, after examining the evidence, what is the most balanced conclusion? The biblical plagues cannot currently be proven in the strict historical sense. Neither can they be confidently dismissed as pure fiction. The evidence suggests that the Exodus story emerged from a real ancient world shaped by environmental crises, political power, and cultural memory. Whether those events also represent miraculous acts of divine intervention ultimately depends on one's understanding of history, faith, and the possibility of the supernatural. More than 3,000 years later, the mystery remains alive. And perhaps that is why the story continues to captivate millions of people around the world. The sands of Egypt still hide countless secrets. The Nile still flows through the same valley. Ancient temples still stand beneath the desert sun. And somewhere between archaeology, science, and faith, the mystery of the biblical plagues continues to wait for its next discovery.